The swinging 60s, the decade in which Britain turned on, tuned in, and dropped out. Or did it? They say if you remember the 60s, then you weren't there. But most of us who lived through the 1960s have no problem remembering what they were like. And let me tell you, it wasn't all about the Beatles and the miniskirts and flower power. I'm going to take you on a 60s trip of a different kind. Forget what you thought you knew about the swinging 60s. This is the story of what the 60s were really like.
Funny thing about the 60s is if you ask most people who were there, what was it like? They'll always say, well, it didn't happen for me.
I don't remember anybody who I worked with a droopy moustache or a caftan or smoking any dope.
This aunt rang my mother and said she thought it was dreadful. My skirt was much too short.
5% of the population thought they were trendy, and 95% definitely didn't want to be trendy.
Sex and drugs and rock and roll. That's the 60s in a nutshell, isn't it? Mods and rockers, rebellious teenagers, the permissive society. Well, not where I came from, and certainly not at the start of the 1960s. The start of the 60s felt and looked a lot like the 1950s. TV was black and white, and to be honest, real life was a bit grey as well. Remember, it was only 15 years since the end of the war, and we hadn't an inkling of the explosion of colour and music just a few years down the road.
What we think of as the swinging 60s didn't start on the 1st of January 1960 by any means. So it's not as though the clock told 12 and then everybody put on a miniskirt. That's not the case at all. What we think of as the 60s didn't start until much later. Indeed, for much of the 1960s, life actually went on just as it had in the 50s.
The 60s would finally be set swinging by the children of the 50s. At the start of the 60s, the so-called baby boom generation born just after the war were coming of age, and we were a force to be reckoned with. Oh, it was a great time to be a teenager.
The reason that that generation was different is very simple and really not amazingly exciting. It's simply that they're richer. They have more money.
Coffee shops mainly, I think we spent our money on. Cinema and a certain amount of records, of course. I can still feel that enthusiasm for wanting to be able to move forward and do things that our parents hadn't been able to do.
But some teens could also be troublemakers, and the establishment hated everything they stood for.
Teenagers become the symbol of a changing society, and so people project all their fears about what's happening to Britain and post-imperial nation, heavy industry dying, all those kinds of things. They project them onto the teenager, and the teenager becomes a kind of scapegoat for everything that's going wrong.
Come on now, were teenagers really so bad? If this 1967 newsreel is anything to go by, they were surprisingly tame.
The Daily Mail got national opinion polls to find out from teenagers which person in all the world they admired most. Surprise, surprise. Hitting the list was good old Mum, #1 in the teen top 10. Voted into second place, the Queen. And the only pop star to get a showing in the first 10 was Elvis Presley. Well, you live and learn.
We were very naive in an awful lot of ways, but yeah, we were a bit more with it than our parents. In fact, we were much more streetwise than our parents were. I mean, really, we thought the world was our oyster. We could do a lot more things, but there were limits. There was a conservative limit.
In Caproni's, Mr. Caproni, an Italian, and he owned Caproni's Ballroom. And on a Saturday night, it was packed. If you had your hair on your collar or over your collar, he cut your hair. That's just the way we lived. It's the way things were. You had to respect people. It was totally different, you know. You didn't really talk back too much. You had to behave. There was no nonsense. You in there was no bar. You got ice cream and tea or coffee.
I spent the early 1960s in Newcastle and Durham, and they were, I think, with hindsight, very, very parochial. Whatever was swinging in London in the 60s never ever got as far as Durham, certainly. We didn't think ourselves deprived up north at the time, but we weren't nearly as lively as it seems down there. I never saw any drugs at all, for instance. Sex, drugs and rock and roll did not happen in Newcastle, at least not in the bit I was in.
Cigarettes, yes, smoking, yeah, that was a bit avant-garde really, but drugs were not so much in. Towards the end of the 60s, yes, of course, you've got the Rolling Stones and you've got the pop groups who were doing it, but it didn't really hit the small towns at that time until you went to university. And I can remember a friend of mine who was a year above us coming back from university saying, "Oh, it's just terrible, there's a drug ring at the university." And we were appalled.
I mean, it's ironic that we think of the 60s as the druggy decade, when, of course, the truth of the matter is there are kind of 12 people in central London who are taking drugs, and the vast majority of the public, including the majority of young people, A, don't take them, and B, disapprove of them. Most people are still sticking to, 27 pints on a Saturday night and a few fags. That's the story. It's not about marijuana and LSD and all of that stuff.
Everybody says that the 1960s was the decade of sexual revolution, that the pill changed women's lives forever. But did the spirit of free love really break down our very British inhibitions?
I think it's only right to be married in church, whether you wear a long white dress or anything else. I still think you should be married by a priest.
They say we're young and we don't know, won't find out till we grow.
Living in sin, as our parents called it, was still a big no-no. People were getting married. In fact, they got married younger than ever.
The fact that they get married so young is very revealing, because what it tells you is that these aren't people who are dedicated to having a good time and sowing their wild oats and all of that business. These are people who fundamentally believe in the kind of old-fashioned moral pillars that have upheld British society for decades.
So much for free love. Marriage had never been so popular. But didn't the advent of the pill change the way women live their lives?
The study done in 1971 at Durham University of female students who were then in their third year, so they would have gone to university in 1968, which found that 91% of them were virgins when they arrived at university, 50% of them were still virgins when they left university, and a third of them strongly disapproved of sex outside marriage. This is not the swinging 60s that we normally associate with the period.
The pill was just coming in, but you couldn't just go to the doctor to get the pill. You know, your parents had to know, and so it didn't happen really so much, because you wouldn't dreamt of telling your parents things like that at that time.
There's a complete myth that the pill changed everything and there was this sexual revolution that followed from the pill. Of course, the reality is completely different. Most young single women never got the pill until the early 1970s because health clinics wouldn't give it to them. So the only people that got the pill, by and large, in the 60s were married women who are not likely to be going and having orgies in West London with great hordes of blokes. In the 60s, most people effectively were still going to bed with a hot water bottle.
Well, the 60s may not have been quite as racy as all that, but music and fashion certainly did spice things up a bit.
Which university sponsors real life on yesterday? Good decision.